Welcome back, friends. Tonight we're diving into something less philosophical, but every bit as intriguing: the food served in Wild West saloons. These places were famous for whiskey, bar fights, and that slightly out-of-tune piano. But what about the meals? Was it really just beans and bacon? Or did those swinging doors hide a few surprises? Before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss more history-filled bedtime stories from the Wild West. If you enjoy these journeys, give the video a like and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing our little community around the world. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's step back in time together. When you stepped into a Wild West saloon, the first thing that greeted you wasn't the lively piano music or the raucous laughter of cowboys playing cards. It was the overwhelming atmosphere, a blend of sights, sounds, and especially smells that defined the frontier experience. The air was thick with the scent of sweaty cowboys who had spent days on horseback, the pungent aroma of wet tobacco, and the stale odour of spilled beer soaking into old wooden floors. Horses tied up outside added their own musky note, and if you were lucky, you might catch a faint whiff of something cooking in the back, hinting at the possibility of a meal. Saloons were the heart of Wild West towns, bustling with a mix of miners, gamblers, drifters, and locals seeking warmth, company, and a break from the harsh realities of frontier life. The decor was simple and rugged: splintered tables, rickety chairs, and a long counter where food and drink were served. There were no menus or waiters. Instead, regulars shouted their orders to the cook, who might respond with a gruff beans or stew. Newcomers were eyed with suspicion, their ability to pay or stay conscious until the food arrived always in question. Despite the roughness, there was a sense of camaraderie. Strangers sat side by side, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes even a brawl. The food was basic: beans, salt pork, stew, meant to fill the belly rather than delight the palate. Yet, in this gritty environment, every meal was a small victory, a moment of comfort in a world where survival was never guaranteed. The saloon was more than just a place to eat and drink. It was a refuge from the dust, danger, and loneliness of the Wild West. Here, men and women found community, forged friendships, and created memories that would last a lifetime. The atmosphere, though far from glamorous, was honest and real. It reflected the spirit of the frontier: tough, resilient, and always ready for whatever came through those swinging doors. In the Wild West, the saloon was where life happened, and everyone who entered became part of its ongoing story. Once you found your place in the saloon, the reality of frontier dining quickly set in. The food served was never about luxury or taste. It was about getting enough calories to face another day in the Wild West. Cowboys, miners, and travellers gathered at rough tables, their faces weathered by sun and dust, ready to eat whatever the cook could provide. The menu was simple and unchanging, dictated by what was available and what could survive the long, harsh journeys across the plains. Meals were a matter of practicality. The cook, often a gruff character with little patience for complaints, worked with limited supplies and even less time. There were no fancy recipes or delicate flavours. Instead, the food was hearty and filling, designed to keep a person going through cattle drives, poker games, and the unpredictable dangers of frontier life. Beans, salt pork, and stew were the staples, each dish a testament to the resourcefulness required to survive in such a rugged environment. Eating in the saloon was a communal experience, but it came with its own risks. You might sit next to a stranger who would become a friend, or someone who might rob you later that night. The atmosphere was thick with stories, laughter, and the occasional tension that could erupt into a brawl. Yet, everyone understood the unspoken rule. You ate what was served, grateful for anything that filled your stomach. Complaints were rare, and if the food made you sick, a shot of whiskey was the usual cure. Despite the lack of variety, there was a certain comfort in the routine. The same beans, the same stew, the same tough bread. Each meal was a reminder of the shared struggle and resilience of those who called the Wild West home. Food was not just sustenance. It was a symbol of survival, a daily ritual that brought people together in the face of adversity. In the end, dining in a Wild West saloon was about more than just eating. It was about enduring, adapting, and finding moments of connection in a world that was often unforgiving. The food may have been plain, but the experience was rich with the spirit of the frontier, where every meal was a small victory and every shared table a testament to the strength of community. The true backbone of every Wild West saloon meal was the hungry bean. No matter how rough the town or how meagre the supplies, beans were always present, simmering in a battered pot over a smoky fire. Their popularity wasn't due to taste or variety, but to their reliability. Beans were cheap, easy to store, and could survive the long, unpredictable journeys across the frontier. For many cowboys and travellers, a bowl of beans was the closest thing to a guaranteed meal. Preparation was straightforward and practical. The cook would pour dried beans into a pot, add water, and let them boil for hours over an open flame. Sometimes, if luck or supplies allowed, a chunk of salt pork or a handful of onions would be tossed in for flavour. But most of the time the beans were served plain, perhaps with a sprinkle of salt and a stale biscuit on the side. The result was a dish that was filling and dependable, if not exactly exciting. Beans were more than just food. They were a symbol of endurance. Cowboys respected them for their ability to keep hunger at bay during long cattle drives or sleepless nights at the poker table. They could be eaten hot or cold, reheated again and again, and even used as makeshift currency in desperate times. Stories circulated about men trading pounds of beans for horses or favours, proof of their value in a world where survival was never certain. Of course, beans had their drawbacks. A saloon full of cowboys who had feasted on beans could quickly become a hazardous place, with the air thick from more than just tobacco smoke. Yet, despite the jokes and complaints, beans remained the staple of the frontier diet. When meat ran out or supplies dwindled, the cook could always rely on beans to feed the hungry crowd. In the Wild West, you didn't love beans. You respected them. They were the unsung heroes of countless meals, the steady presence that kept people going when times were tough. Every bowl served in a saloon was a reminder of the resourcefulness and resilience required to survive on the edge of civilization. Beans may have been simple, but in the harsh world of the frontier they were often enough. While beans formed the foundation of every meal, they were rarely served alone. In the Wild West saloon, a plate of beans was often accompanied by salt pork and a stale biscuit, creating a trio that defined frontier dining. Salt pork was a staple not because of its flavour, but because of its durability. Preserved in barrels of brine, It could withstand months of travel and harsh conditions without spoiling. Cowboys and cooks alike relied on its toughness, knowing that even after weeks on the trail, salt pork would still be edible, if not exactly appetizing. The cook would slice off a chunk of salt pork, fry it in a skillet until it sizzled, and serve it alongside the beans. Sometimes the pork was crispy and flavorful, offering a rare moment of culinary pleasure. More often, it was chewy and salty, a challenge for even the strongest jaws. Yet, its presence on the plate was a comfort, a sign that the meal was complete. The fat from the pork was never wasted. It was used to fry potatoes, biscuits, or even tossed into the stew to add richness. Biscuits too played their part. Fresh biscuits were a luxury, soft and flaky, but most of the time they were hard and dry, baked days before and left to sit near the stove. Cowboys would use them to mop up the last bits of beans or stew, grateful for anything that added substance to their meal. Occasionally a cook might offer a splash of molasses or a chunk of butter, transforming the humble biscuit into a rare treat. The combination of beans, salt pork and biscuit was more than just food. It was a ritual. Each element brought its own story of survival and resourcefulness. Cowboys respected the cook who could make the most of limited supplies, turning simple ingredients into a meal that fueled long rides and late nights. The flavors were plain, sometimes even bland, but the sense of community and resilience made every bite meaningful. In the Wild West, you didn't eat for pleasure, you ate to endure. The trio of beans, salt pork and biscuit was a testament to the ingenuity of frontier life, a daily reminder that even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to share a meal and keep moving forward. If beans were the soul of the Wild West saloon meal, then salt pork was its backbone, greasy, tough, and utterly dependable. Unlike the bacon that many cowboys dreamed of, salt pork was a slab of pork belly, heavily salted and sometimes smoked, preserved in barrels that lined the kitchen walls. Its resilience was legendary. It could survive months in a saddlebag, a thunderstorm, or even a bar brawl without changing texture. For the cook, salt pork was a lifesaver, always ready to add substance to a meal when fresh meat was nowhere to be found. The process of preparing salt pork was simple, but required a certain frontier toughness. Slices were cut thick and fried in a hot skillet, the fat sizzling and popping as it cooked. When done right, the pork was crispy and flavorful, a rare treat that could make a cowboy forget the monotony of beans. More often, though, it was chewy and salty, a challenge to eat but a reliable source of energy. The fat rendered from the pork was precious, used to fry potatoes, biscuits, or even tossed into stews to add a rich, savoury note. Nothing went to waste. The rind was sometimes thrown into the stew pot or given to the dogs, while the leaner bits were diced and mixed with beans. Cowboys learned quickly to chew slow and savour every bite, knowing that salt pork was as much about survival as it was about taste. Sometimes the pork was suspicious, tinged green or smelling odd. But in the Wild West, the question wasn't, is it fresh, but, did it kill the last guy? If not, it was good enough. Salt pork was versatile too. It could be eaten alone, packed for long rides, or traded among cowboys as a valuable commodity. Its presence in a meal was a sign of resourcefulness, a testament to the cook's ability to make the most of limited supplies. In a world where you might ride 60 miles before your next hot meal, salt pork was a trusted companion. In the end, salt pork wasn't elegant or healthy, but it got the job done. It fueled the bodies and spirits of those who braved the frontier, offering a salty punch of comfort in a land where every meal was a small victory. In the Wild West saloon kitchen, nothing from the salt pork ever went to waste. The cooks, often seasoned by years of hardship and necessity, knew how to make the most of every scrap. The fat rendered from frying salt pork was a prized ingredient, used to add flavour and richness to nearly every dish. Potatoes, biscuits, and even vegetables were fried in this golden grease, transforming otherwise bland food into something hearty and satisfying. The aroma of sizzling pork fat filled the air, mingling with the ever-present scents of tobacco and whiskey. The pork rind, tough and chewy, had its own destiny. Sometimes it was tossed into the stew pot, where hours of simmering would soften it just enough to be edible. Other times it was handed to the saloon dogs or unlucky newcomers who didn't know any better. A single bite was enough to teach respect for the cook's warnings. Chew slow or choke proud. Even the leaner bits of pork were diced and mixed into beans, giving the staple dish a salty punch that cowboys craved after long days on the trail. Resourcefulness was the rule in the saloon kitchen. The cook's ability to stretch ingredients and create filling meals from limited supplies was legendary. Every part of the pork had a purpose, and nothing was discarded unless it was truly inedible. This frugality wasn't just about saving money, it was about survival. In a world where fresh food was scarce and supply wagons unpredictable, making the most of what you had was a matter of pride and necessity. The cowboys respected the cook's ingenuity. They knew that every meal was a product of careful planning and hard-earned experience. The fat from the pork made biscuits crisp and potatoes golden. The rind added depth to stews, and even the scraps could be traded or saved for leaner times. In the Wild West, waste was a luxury no one could afford. This spirit of resourcefulness defined the saloon experience. Meals were simple but filling, crafted from whatever was available, and served with a side of grit and determination. The cook's skill in using every part of the pork was a testament to the resilience and creativity that kept the frontier alive, one meal at a time. Stew was the great equalizer in the Wild West saloon, a dish that brought together all the odds and ends of the kitchen into one bubbling pot. No matter how meagre the supplies or how unpredictable the day, there was always a way to make stew. The cook would start with water, maybe a handful of beans or potatoes, and then add whatever meat or vegetables hadn't disappeared or spoiled. Beef was a luxury, but more often the stew featured rabbit, squirrel, or even rattlesnake, anything that could be caught or traded. The quality of the meat varied wildly. Some days the stew was rich with tender chunks from the local butcher. Other days it was a mystery, with pieces you'd rather not identify. Cowboys learned not to ask too many questions, especially if the dog population in town had recently dropped. Vegetables, when available, were boiled until they lost all shape and colour, becoming part of the thick, hearty broth. Carrots became orange smudges, onions vanished, and potatoes held on as long as they could before surrendering to the simmering pot. Spices were a rare luxury. Most of the time, the stew got its flavour from salt, the cook's hands, and whatever happened to be on the knife. Black pepper was a sign of a fancy establishment, and chili powder was a treat that could clear your sinuses in an instant. Despite its humble ingredients, stew was comfort food for the weary. It was hot, filling, and could be stretched to feed a dozen men or reheated for days, growing thicker and more flavourful with each passing meal. Eating stew in the saloon was a communal experience. Cowboys gathered around the pot, sharing stories and laughter as they filled their bowls. The stew was never the same twice, and that unpredictability became part of its charm. It was a dish born of necessity, a testament to the cook's creativity and the resilience of those who called the frontier home. In the Wild West, you didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible. The stew pot was a symbol of survival, a daily reminder that even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to come together and share a meal. The true character of Wild West stew came from its unpredictable mix of meats. While beef was always preferred, the realities of frontier life meant that cooks had to be creative and resourceful. Rabbit, squirrel, and even rattlesnake often found their way into the pot, each adding its own unique flavour and texture. Cowboys knew better than to ask too many questions about the meat in their bowls. The less you knew, the easier it was to enjoy your meal. Sometimes, a lucky hunter would bring in fresh game, and the stew would be rich and satisfying. Other times, the meat was tougher, older, or simply mysterious. There were stories of travellers finding boot strings or other oddities in their stew, but most took it in stride, grateful for anything that filled their stomachs. The cook's skill was in making the most of whatever was available, turning even the most questionable ingredients into something edible. The variety of meats reflected the unpredictable nature of life in the Wild West. One day you might feast on tender beef. The next, you'd be chewing on squirrel or rattlesnake, hoping for a bit of seasoning to mask the taste. The stew pot was a place where all the leftovers and scraps came together, creating a dish that was never the same twice. It was a culinary adventure, a gamble that matched the spirit of the frontier itself. Vegetables, when present, were boiled until they blended into the broth, adding bulk and a hint of flavour. Potatoes, carrots, and onions were common, but their presence depended on the season and the success of the local harvest. The result was a thick, hearty stew that could feed a crowd and last for days, growing richer with each reheating. For the cowboys and travellers who gathered in the saloon, stew was more than just food. It was a symbol of resilience and adaptability. It brought people together, offering warmth and comfort after long days on the trail. No matter what went into the pot, the stew was always welcome, a reminder that in the Wild West, survival depended on making the most of what you had. The unpredictable mix of meats and flavours was a testament to the ingenuity and spirit of those who called the frontier home. While the meats in Wild West stew were always a surprise, the vegetables were a different kind of challenge. Fresh produce was a rare luxury on the frontier, and when it did appear in the saloon kitchen, it was often past its prime. Carrots, onions, and potatoes were the most common additions, but their fate was always the same. Hours of boiling in the stew pot until they lost all shape, colour, and texture. Carrots, once bright and crisp, became little more than orange smudges floating in the thick broth. Onions, prized for their flavour, dissolved completely, leaving only a hint of sweetness behind. Potatoes were the true survivors, holding their form longer than most, but even they eventually surrendered to the relentless heat, becoming soft and starchy, blending into the stew's hearty base. The cook's goal was never to create a gourmet dish. but to make something filling and nourishing. Vegetables were boiled to oblivion, their flavours mingling with the meat and beans, creating a meal that was more about sustenance than taste. Cowboys didn't complain. They knew that every spoonful was a victory against hunger, a small comfort after long days on the trail. Sometimes the lack of fresh vegetables was made up for with dried or preserved ones, but these were even less appealing. The result was a stew that was thick, hearty, and sometimes a little bland, but always reliable. The vegetables, no matter how overcooked, added bulk and nutrition, helping to stretch the meal and feed more hungry mouths. In the Wild West, the presence of vegetables in your stew was a sign of good fortune, even if they were boiled beyond recognition. It was a reminder of the challenges of frontier life, where every ingredient was precious and nothing was wasted. The cook's ability to transform humble vegetables into a filling meal was a testament to the resourcefulness and resilience that defined the saloon experience. For the cowboys and travellers gathered around the table, the stew was more than just food. It was a symbol of survival, a daily ritual that brought people together and kept them going, no matter how tough the world outside became. In the Wild West saloon, seasoning was a luxury few could afford. The cook's approach to flavour was practical and inventive, shaped by whatever was available in the kitchen, or could be traded from passing merchants. Salt was the most common addition, sprinkled generously to bring out the taste of beans, meat, and vegetables. Sometimes, if fortune smiled, a pinch of black pepper or a dash of chili powder would find its way into the pot, transforming the stew into something memorable. Spices were rare and treasured. A cook who managed to secure a small tin of pepper or a handful of dried herbs was considered a magician, able to turn even the plainest meal into a feast. But most of the time, the stew's flavour came from the ingredients themselves and the hands that prepared them. The knife used to chop meat and vegetables often carried traces of previous meals, adding a subtle complexity to each new batch of stew. Cowboys didn't expect gourmet seasoning. They were grateful for anything that made the food more palatable, knowing that the real goal was nourishment and warmth. The cook's creativity shone through in the little touches, a splash of lard for richness, a handful of wild onions for bite, or even a stray spice blown in through the open window. Every meal was a reflection of the cook's resourcefulness and the unpredictable nature of frontier life. On rare occasions, a saloon might offer stew with a real kick, thanks to a generous helping of chili powder. This was a treat, clearing sinuses and waking up tired travellers with its fiery heat. More often, though, the seasoning was subtle, a background note that complemented the hearty flavours of beans, meat, and vegetables. The lack of elaborate spices didn't diminish the value of the meal. In fact, it highlighted the resilience and adaptability of those who lived on the edge of civilization. The cook's ability to make the most of limited resources was a point of pride, and every bowl of stew was a testament to the ingenuity that kept the Wild West alive. For the cowboys and travellers gathered in the saloon, the simple act of sharing a well-seasoned meal was a comfort, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, a little flavour could make all the difference. While the main dishes in a Wild West saloon were hearty and filling, it was the bread that truly completed the meal. Nearly every saloon offered something bread-like to soak up the stew and beans, and this usually came in one of two forms: soft, flaky biscuits or hardtack. Biscuits were a rare delight, especially when fresh. Warm from the cast-iron pan, they were buttery and tender, a small luxury in a world where comfort was hard to find. Cowboys cherished these moments, savouring each bite and using the biscuits to mop up every last drop of broth. The secret to good biscuits was often a closely guarded one. Some cooks swore by lard, others by buttermilk, and a few simply relied on luck and experience. When biscuits were served hot and fresh, they could make a man feel as if he'd stumbled into a proper kitchen, far from the dust and danger of the frontier. Sometimes, the cook would add a splash of molasses or a chunk of butter, elevating the humble biscuit to something truly special. But more often than not, the bread on offer was hardtack, a dense, dry slab made from flour and water, baked until it was nearly indestructible. Originally designed for soldiers and sailors, hardtack found its way west because it never spoiled. Eating hardtack required strategy and patience. Cowboys would inspect it for weevils, soak it in stew, coffee or whiskey to soften it, and then chew with determination. Even after soaking, hardtack was a challenge, and many a cowboy ended up with a chipped tooth for his efforts. Despite its toughness, hardtack served its purpose well. It was cheap, portable and filling, making it an essential part of the frontier diet. Cowboys packed it for long journeys, knowing it would last through weeks of travel and unpredictable weather. In a world where calories mattered more than taste, hardtack was a reliable companion. Whether it was a plate of steaming biscuits or a puck of hardtack, bread in the Wild West saloon was more than just food. It was a symbol of endurance and resourcefulness. Each bite was a reminder of the challenges faced and the small comforts found along the way, bringing a sense of home to even the roughest corners of the frontier. Hardtack, the bread's undead cousin, was a fixture in the Wild West saloon, especially when fresh biscuits were a rare luxury. This simple slab of flour and water, baked until it was nearly indestructible, was originally made for soldiers and sailors, but quickly became a staple for cowboys and travellers. Its greatest strength was its longevity. Hardtack never went bad, surviving long journeys and harsh conditions with ease. Eating hardtack was an experience in itself. Cowboys would first inspect the hard, dry biscuit for weevils, which were considered just an extra crunch rather than a reason to discard it. The real challenge was making it edible. Most would soak hardtack in stew, coffee, or even whiskey, sometimes waiting 10 minutes or more for it to soften enough to chew. Even then, it was a test of patience and jaw strength, and many a cowboy ended up with a chipped tooth or sore gums after a meal. Despite its toughness, hardtack was valued for its practicality. It was cheap, portable, and filling, making it the perfect companion for long rides across the frontier. Cowboys packed it in their saddlebags, knowing it would last through weeks of travel and unpredictable weather. In a world where calories mattered more than taste, hardtack was a reliable source of sustenance. The saloon cook sometimes tried to improve the hardtack by serving it with stew or beans, letting the flavours soak in and soften the biscuit. On rare occasions, a splash of molasses or a chunk of butter would be added, transforming the hardtack into a treat. But most of the time, it was a matter of endurance, chewing, soaking, and finally swallowing, grateful for anything that filled the belly. Hardtack was more than just food. It was a symbol of the resilience and resourcefulness required to survive in the Wild West. Cowboys respected its durability and relied on it during tough times. Each bite was a reminder of the challenges faced and the small victories won along the way. In the saloon, whether you were handed a steaming biscuit or a puck of hardtack, you knew you were part of a tradition that valued survival above all else. For cowboys and travelers in the Wild West, portability was as important as taste when it came to food. Biscuits and hardtack, though simple, were prized for their ability to withstand the rigors of long journeys across the frontier. Cowboys packed these durable breads into their saddlebags, knowing they would last for weeks without spoiling, providing a reliable source of sustenance no matter where the trail led. Biscuits, when fresh, were a rare treat. Their soft, flaky texture and buttery flavour brought comfort and a sense of home, even in the harshest conditions. But more often, it was hardtack that filled the role of travel companion. Its dense, dry form made it nearly indestructible, surviving heat, rain, and rough handling. Cowboys learned to appreciate its resilience, even if eating it required patience and strong teeth. On the trail, meals were often improvised. A cowboy might soak his hardtack in coffee or stew, waiting for it to soften before attempting to chew. Biscuits, if available, were used to mop up the last drops of gravy or beans, making every crumb count. The practicality of these breads meant that even in the most remote locations, a cowboy could count on having something to eat. The act of packing biscuits and hardtack became a ritual before every journey. Cowboys would wrap them in cloth or store them in tin containers, ensuring they stayed dry and protected from the elements. These simple foods were more than just nourishment. They were a symbol of preparedness and self-reliance, essential qualities for survival in the unpredictable Wild West. Stories circulated about cowboys trading biscuits or hardtack for favours, supplies, or even a horse in desperate times. Their value extended beyond the dinner table, becoming a form of currency among those who understood their worth. In a world where every mile brought new challenges, the ability to carry food that lasted was a small but significant victory. Biscuits and hardtack were the unsung heroes of frontier life, supporting cowboys through long rides, sleepless nights, and uncertain days. Their presence in a saddlebag was a reminder that, no matter how tough the journey, there was always a way to keep moving forward, fueled by the simple strength of bread. No meal in the Wild West Saloon was complete without a cup of cowboy coffee. Unlike the refined brews of city cafes, cowboy coffee was a bold, unfiltered concoction that matched the rugged spirit of the frontier. The process was simple. Water was drawn from whatever source was available, sometimes a stream, sometimes a barrel, and poured into a battered kettle. A handful of coarse coffee grounds, measured by instinct rather than precision, was tossed in, and the mixture was boiled until it turned black and strong enough to wake even the weariest traveller. There were no filters or fancy gadgets. The ground settled at the bottom of the cup, and every sip was a gamble between caffeine and grit. Cowboys learned to drink carefully, savouring the warmth and energy the coffee provided, even if the last mouthful was more grounds than liquid. The brew was thick, dark, and often described as tasting like burnt dreams and vengeance, but it was beloved for its ability to keep men alert through long nights and cold mornings. Coffee in the saloon was more than just a drink. It was a ritual. Cowboys gathered around the fire, tin cups in hand, sharing stories and laughter as they waited for the kettle to boil. The aroma of strong coffee mingled with the scents of tobacco and stew, creating an atmosphere of camaraderie and comfort. For many, the first sip of coffee was a moment of peace before the day's challenges began. Sometimes, the cook would stretch the coffee by reusing old grounds, resulting in a brew that tasted of disappointment but still delivered the necessary jolt. On rare occasions, sugar or canned milk might be added, transforming the bitter drink into a small luxury. But most of the time, cowboy coffee was served plain and hot, a testament to the simplicity and resilience of frontier life. Despite its roughness, cowboy coffee was cherished. It fueled cattle drives, poker games, and countless adventures, becoming an essential part of the Wild West experience. For the cowboys and travelers who relied on its strength, coffee was more than just a beverage. It was a lifeline, a source of warmth and energy in a world that demanded endurance and grit. Cowboy coffee was not for the faint of heart. Its strength and bitterness were legendary, and every cup was a test of endurance. The brew was so potent that it seemed to stare back at you, daring you to take another sip. Cowboys would grimace as they drank, their faces contorting with each gulp, but they knew that this gritty, unfiltered coffee was essential for surviving the demands of frontier life. The last mouthful was always the hardest. By then, the grounds had settled, creating a thick layer at the bottom of the cup. Some cowboys would toss the dregs into the fire, while others, too tired to care, swallowed them for an extra dose of caffeine and fibre. The coffee was more than just a drink. It was a source of warmth on cold mornings, a companion during lonely night watches, and a remedy for hangovers brought on by too much whiskey and questionable stew. Despite its roughness, cowboy coffee was cherished. It was a symbol of resilience and adaptability, proof that even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to create comfort. The cook's ability to brew a strong pot was respected, and a good cup of coffee could lift spirits and bring people together. Cowboys would gather around the fire, sharing stories and laughter as they sipped their coffee, finding camaraderie in the simple ritual. Sometimes, the coffee was stretched by reusing old grounds, resulting in a brew that tasted of disappointment, but still delivered the necessary jolt. On rare occasions, sugar or canned milk might be added, transforming the bitter drink into a small luxury. But most of the time, cowboy coffee was served plain and hot, a testament to the simplicity and resilience of frontier life. For the cowboys and travelers who relied on its strength, coffee was more than just a beverage. It was a lifeline. It fueled cattle drives, poker games, and countless adventures, becoming an essential part of the Wild West experience. The grimace that accompanied each sip was a badge of honor, a sign that you were tough enough to face whatever the day might bring. In the Wild West, coffee was not just a drink, it was a way of life. In the Wild West saloon, meat was more than just food. It was a symbol of status, luck, and sometimes sheer bravery. If a cowboy had enough coins in his pocket, he might order a steak, hoping for a taste of luxury in a world where such moments were rare. But the reality of saloon steak was often far from the romantic ideal. More often than not, the cook would serve a tough, overcooked slab of beef, fried in a pan with lard until it was scorched into submission. There were no garnishes, no fancy sides, just meat, plain and simple. Asking for a steak cook to order was a fool's errand. If a customer dared to request it medium rare, the cook would likely respond with a blank stare or a gruff laugh. The steak was served as it came, and you were expected to be grateful for it. When fresh beef wasn't available, the saloon turned to other options: dried jerky, salted buffalo, venison, or even wild boar if someone had been lucky on a hunt. The variety depended on the season, the town's resources and the cook's connections. In mining towns and remote settlements, meat got even more creative. Squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast and jackrabbit seasoned with whatever was on hand were all fair game. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it might end up on the plate. Sometimes the meat was so mysterious that cowboys learned not to ask questions. If you chewed too long or found something resembling a whisker, you simply sipped your whiskey, nodded, and accepted your fate. There was also the risk of age. Some cuts had been hanging around long enough to earn names, and the cook would slice off the bad parts, drown the rest in gravy and call it well-aged. If your plate twitched when you poked it, you were entitled to a raised eyebrow and nothing more. But on rare occasions, when the meat was fresh and the cook was sober, you might get a real meal, a sizzling slab of beef, a fried egg on top, and maybe a biscuit on the side. For most cowboys, though, meat was a gamble. You ate what was served and hoped it didn't eat you back. In the Wild West, every meal was an adventure, and a plate of meat was a reminder of the risks and rewards that came with life on the frontier. When fresh beef was scarce in the Wild West saloon, cooks turned to a variety of other meats to keep hungry cowboys satisfied. Dried jerky was a common sight, its tough, salty strips providing a portable source of protein for those on the move. Salted buffalo, with its rich flavour and chewy texture, was another favourite, especially among those who remembered the great herds that once roamed the plains. Venison, brought in by lucky hunters, added a touch of wildness to the menu, while wild boar, if someone managed to catch one, was considered a true prize. The selection of meats was always unpredictable, shaped by the fortunes of the day and the skills of the local hunters. Sometimes the cook would serve a plate piled high with jerky, buffalo and venison, each piece telling a story of survival and resourcefulness. Other times the meat was more mysterious, its origins known only to the cook and perhaps the bravest of the regulars. Cowboys learned to accept whatever was placed before them, grateful for the nourishment and the chance to share a meal with friends. In mining towns and remote settlements, creativity was key. Squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast, and jackrabbit seasoned with whatever spices were available became staples for those willing to try something new. The cook's ability to transform these unconventional ingredients into hearty meals was respected, and even the most skeptical cowboy would eventually take a bite, if only to prove his toughness. The variety of meats reflected the unpredictable nature of life on the frontier. One day, you might feast on fresh venison. The next, you'd be chewing on jerky or salted buffalo, hoping for a bit of gravy to soften the bite. The saloon was a place where all kinds of meat found their way onto the plate, each meal a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of those who called the Wild West home. For the cowboys and travellers gathered around the table, the ever-changing selection of meats was a reminder of the challenges and rewards of frontier life. Every meal was an adventure, a chance to taste something new and share stories of the hunt. In the Wild West, meat was more than just food. It was a symbol of survival, community, and the spirit of exploration. While hearty meats and beans filled the bellies of Wild West cowboys, dessert was a rare and cherished treat in the saloon. Most days the cook had little time or ingredients for anything sweet, but when fortune allowed, cornbread became the go-to comfort. Made from simple cornmeal, water or milk, lard, and sometimes a dash of baking powder, cornbread was versatile and could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or even dropped by spoonfuls into boiling stew for a quick fix. Cornbread was best when served fresh, its crumbly texture and slightly sweet flavour offering a welcome change from the usual fare. However, more often than not, it was dry and hardened from sitting near the stove all day, a testament to the tough conditions of frontier life. Cowboys didn't mind. They knew that even stale cornbread could be transformed into something special with a little ingenuity. The real magic happened when molasses entered the picture. This dark, sticky syrup was a miracle ingredient, turning even the driest wedge of cornbread into a treat that could lift the spirits of the weariest traveller. Molasses was affordable, kept well in the heat, and masked the sins of overbaked goods. If the cook had a barrel of it, cowboys considered themselves lucky. A warm drizzle of molasses over skillet-fried cornbread was the closest thing to cake most would taste for weeks. Sometimes the cook would get creative, pouring molasses over cornbread and adding a pinch of salt or spice. It wasn't fancy, but it was sweet enough to calm nerves after a rough ride or a tense poker game. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert, quick, cheap, and filling. It was a small luxury in a world where survival was the priority. For the cowboys and travellers who gathered in the saloon, dessert was more than just food. It was a reminder that not everything in the West was harsh or unforgiving. A simple piece of cornbread, sweetened with molasses, brought comfort and a sense of home, even in the dust and grit of the frontier. In the Wild West, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that life could still offer moments of sweetness. Molasses was the unsung hero of Wild West desserts, bringing a touch of sweetness to the otherwise rugged meals served in saloons. When cornbread was dry and crumbly, as it often was after sitting out all day, molasses transformed it into something almost magical. Cowboys looked forward to this simple pleasure, knowing that a drizzle of the dark syrup could turn even the toughest wedge of cornbread into a treat worth savouring. Molasses was affordable and easy to store, making it a practical choice for cooks who wanted to offer a little comfort without breaking the bank. Its thick, sticky texture clung to the cornbread, adding a rich sweetness that masked any dryness or staleness. If the cook was feeling generous, he might warm the molasses before serving, creating a gooey topping that melted into the bread and brought smiles to even the most stoic faces. Sometimes the cook would get creative, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and adding a pinch of salt or spice for extra flavour. This wasn't a fancy dessert. There was no icing, whipped cream, or elaborate presentation. But in the Wild West, such luxuries were unnecessary. What mattered was the comfort and satisfaction that came from a simple, sweet bite after a long day on the trail or a tense night in the poker room. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert in many saloons, quick to prepare and filling enough to calm nerves and settle stomachs. It was a small luxury in a world where survival was the priority, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions there was room for a little joy. Cowboys would gather around the table sharing stories and laughter as they enjoyed their dessert, grateful for the moment of sweetness in an otherwise gritty existence. For those living on the edge of civilization, molasses was more than just a topping. It was a symbol of hope and resilience. It proved that even in the dust and danger of the frontier, life could still offer moments of comfort and delight. In the Wild West, dessert didn't need to be elaborate. It just needed to remind you that not everything was hard and unforgiving. Sometimes, A simple drizzle of molasses was all it took to make the world feel a little brighter. Breakfast in the Wild West Saloon was a rare and special occasion, especially when eggs and chicken were on the menu. These items were considered luxuries, far more precious than the usual beans and salt pork. Fresh eggs were almost as valuable as gold, and their presence signalled either a stroke of luck or a well-connected cook. Chickens were not easy to keep in the rough conditions of the frontier. They were prone to wandering off, being stolen, or falling prey to hungry foxes. If a saloon managed to serve eggs and chicken, it meant they had their own flock, a reliable supplier, or perhaps a secret smuggling arrangement with a neighbouring town. Ordering eggs in the Wild West was always a gamble. Sometimes they were fresh, sometimes not, and the cook's mood often determined how they were prepared. Scrambled eggs might be served to disguise their age or colour, while fried eggs could arrive with yolks as tough as leather. Cowboys learned not to ask too many questions. If the eggs wobbled suspiciously on the plate, it was usually a sign to order whiskey instead. Chicken, when available, was another treat. It was rarely the plump, juicy bird one might hope for. More often, it was a scrawny, tough piece of meat, fried in lard until the flavour gave up. Still, it was hot, it was meat, and most importantly, it wasn't beans again. Cowboys would eat it gratefully, even if the drumstick was the size of a thumb or the gravy came with a stray feather. The presence of eggs and chicken at breakfast was a status symbol for any saloon. It showed that the establishment could offer something beyond the usual canned or preserved fare. If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, word would spread quickly among the locals, and the cook's reputation would grow. Of course, if the meal led to food poisoning, it was just another reminder of the risks of frontier life. For the cowboys and travellers who enjoyed such a breakfast, eggs and chicken represented hope and survival. They were a sign that despite the hardships, there were still moments of comfort and abundance to be found. In the Wild West, a good breakfast was more than just a meal. It was a promise that you might live to drink and laugh again by nightfall. Eggs and chicken, though rare, were not always the culinary delights cowboys hoped for in the Wild West Saloon. The reality was often far less glamorous than the promise. Eggs, when served, could be scrambled to hide their age, or fried until the yolks turned rubbery. Sometimes, the cook's only goal was to make them look edible, regardless of their actual freshness. Cowboys quickly learned that if an egg wobbled suspiciously on the plate, it was best to reach for a shot of whiskey instead of a fork. Chicken, too, was a gamble. The birds that made it to the saloon kitchen were usually scrawny and tough, having survived the harsh conditions of the frontier. Fried in lard until the flavour tapped out, the meat was often bony and chewy, but it was still a welcome change from the endless beans and salt pork. Cowboys would eat it gratefully, even if the drumstick was barely bigger than a thumb or the gravy came with a stray feather, a reminder of just how close to the source their food really was. Despite these shortcomings, eggs and chicken were symbols of status and hope. Their presence on the breakfast table meant that the saloon had managed to secure something fresh, something that didn't come from a can or a barrel. If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, word would spread quickly among the locals, and the cook's reputation would grow. Cowboys would tell stories about the rare good meal for weeks, and the saloon would become a destination for those seeking a taste of comfort. Of course, there was always the risk of food poisoning, a constant companion in the unpredictable world of frontier dining. But for most, The chance to eat something different was worth the gamble. Eggs and chicken represented more than just food. They were a sign of survival, a promise that life on the edge of civilization could still offer moments of abundance and joy. In the Wild West, breakfast was more than just a meal. It was a ritual, a moment of hope before the day's challenges began. Whether the eggs were perfect or the chicken was tough, cowboys gathered around the table, sharing stories and laughter, grateful for the small comforts that made life on the frontier bearable. In the Wild West Saloon, pie was more than just a dessert. It was a statement. If you walked in and saw a pie sitting on the bar, steam rising from its golden crust, and the scent of apples wafting through the smoky air, you knew the cook had gone above and beyond. Pie was a rare treat, a sign that someone in the kitchen cared enough to put in extra effort, and for many cowboys, it was a taste of home in a land far from comfort. But pie in the Wild West was not the perfect lattice-topped pastry of city bakeries. It was a rough, rustic affair, often made with canned or dried fruit and served lukewarm at best. The crust might be uneven, the filling a mix of whatever was available, apples, peaches, berries, or even raisins masquerading as something more exotic. Whipped cream was unheard of unless a cow happened to wander into town, and most pies were served plain, relying on sugar and optimism to carry the flavour. Despite its humble origins, pie was highly valued. Cowboys would travel from neighbouring towns for a chance at a good slice, and a warm, flaky pie could spark fierce competition among the regulars. There were stories of poker games ending in gunfire over the last piece, and taking the final slice was considered as serious an offence as cheating at cards. In a world where men had been stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie was practically sacred. Not all pies were created equal, of course. Some were mostly crust, others experimental, and a few had fillings that only vaguely resembled fruit. But when the stars aligned, when the cook was sober, the oven was hot, and the fruit was fresh, the pie became a memory worth cherishing. Cowboys would savour each bite, letting the sweetness remind them of better days and distant kitchens. Pie was more than just food. It was hope served on a tin plate. In the dust and grit of the frontier, a slice of pie was a rare luxury, a moment of joy that brought people together and lifted spirits. For the cowboys and travellers who gathered in the saloon, pie was a reminder that even in the wildest places, there was still room for sweetness and celebration. The arrival of pie in a Wild West saloon was enough to stir excitement and sometimes trouble among the regulars. A good slice of pie was a rare luxury, and its presence could quickly turn a quiet evening into a lively contest. Cowboys, miners, and travellers would eye the dessert with anticipation, knowing that the last piece was as coveted as a winning poker hand. The competition for pie was fierce, and stories abounded of games and arguments that escalated over who would claim the final slice. In some saloons, pie became the centerpiece of social gatherings. After a long day on the trail or a tense night at the card table, men would gather around, sharing stories and laughter as they enjoyed their dessert. But as the pie disappeared, the mood could shift. A simple disagreement over the last piece might lead to heated words, and in the Wild West, tempers flared easily. There were tales of poker games ending in gunfire, not over money, but over dessert disputes. Who took the last slice was a charge as serious as cheating at cards, and more than one cowboy had found himself in a brawl over a wedge of pie. Despite the drama, pie brought people together. It was a symbol of comfort and celebration, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions there were moments worth savouring. The cook who could produce a warm, flaky pie earned respect and gratitude, and the saloon that served it became a destination for those seeking a taste of home. Cowboys would travel from neighbouring towns, drawn by the promise of a good dessert and the camaraderie that came with sharing it. Not every pie was perfect, of course. Some were mostly crust, others filled with experimental combinations of dried fruit and sugar. But when the stars aligned and the cook's skills shone through, the pie became a memory to cherish. The sweetness lingered long after the last bite, fueling stories and laughter late into the night. In the Wild West, pie was more than just food. It was a reason to gather, to compete, and to celebrate. The disputes it sparked were a testament to its value, and the joy it brought was a reminder that even in a world of dust and danger, there was still room for sweetness and friendship. Cheese in the Wild West saloon was a rare and risky treat, much like a high-stakes poker game. It wasn't the neatly wrapped wheels found in city shops, but rather a product of local ingenuity and necessity. Most cheese was made nearby, often by someone who had learned the basics of dairy fermentation through trial and error. The results varied widely. Some cheeses were hard, yellow, and suspiciously sweaty, while others were soft, crumbly, and had a strong, assertive aroma. Refrigeration was a luxury few could afford, so cheese was often aged in unpredictable conditions. Sometimes it was stored in a cool cave, but more often it simply sat in the saloon kitchen, developing a personality of its own. Cowboys never quite knew what to expect when they bit into a slice. Was it cheddar, something vaguely Swiss, or just a lump of salty dairy guesswork? If the cheese squeaked or crumbled, it was all part of the adventure. Cheese was usually served in chunks alongside bread, jerky, or, if luck held, a pickle. It helped balance the saltiness of the other foods and provided a welcome boost of protein between brawls and long rides. On occasion, the cook would melt cheese over beans or toast it on cornbread, adding a touch of richness to otherwise plain fare. But not all cheese was created equal. Some was little more than old butter gone wrong, or curdled milk pressed into a bar shape and rolled in pepper to distract from its flavour. Despite its unpredictability, cheese was valued for its rarity. A saloon that offered cheese stood out, signalling connections to a local farm or at least access to a cow that hadn't been rustled. Offering cheese was a flex, a symbol of civilization in a place where most people still bathed with sand. Cowboys would inspect, sniff and tap their cheese before eating, knowing that in the West every meal was a gamble. For those who braved the frontier, cheese was more than just food. It was a sign of resourcefulness and a taste of home. Whether it was hard, soft, or somewhere in between, cheese brought a sense of comfort and adventure to the saloon table, reminding everyone that even in the wildest places there was room for a little culinary risk. Pickled foods were a staple of the Wild West saloon, not just for their tangy flavour, but for their remarkable shelf life. Before the days of reliable refrigeration, cooks relied on vinegar and brine to preserve everything from vegetables to eggs and even fruit. The result was a colourful array of jars lining the whistles behind the bar, each filled with pickled cucumbers, onions, eggs, and sometimes even peaches or pears. These jars were as much a part of the saloon's character as the whiskey bottles and poker chips. Pickled cucumbers were the classic choice, crunchy, sharp, and sometimes a little too green. They were served as sides, chasers for whiskey, or simply something to chew on between bad decisions. If the cook had access to fresh garlic and spices, the pickles could be a real treat. More often, they tasted of regret and rainwater, but Cowboys ate them anyway, grateful for the variety. Pickled eggs were a true saloon staple. Floating in cloudy jars, they looked like ghostly eyeballs and had a texture that was more about endurance than enjoyment. Some cowboys swore by them, claiming they were a quick shot of protein that mostly stayed down. Others swore at them, but the eggs remained a fixture, especially for those who needed a snack with their whiskey. Pickled onions were common in mining towns, their sharp, tangy flavour strong enough to chase off unwanted conversation. One bite could clear your sinuses and ensure you'd be remembered at the next cattle drive. Occasionally the cook would get creative and pickle dried fruit, creating a dish that was confusing but strangely addictive. It wasn't quite dessert, nor was it dinner, just wet, vinegary optimism in a jar. The beauty of pickled goods was their longevity. A saloon could keep jars around for months, sometimes years, without worrying about spoilage. In a place where meat went bad faster than a poker hand, this was invaluable. Not all pickled items were created equal, and sometimes the jars held surprises, bones, odd flavours, or labels that simply read, "maybe pork." But cowboys ate them for survival, not pleasure. In the Wild West, pickled foods were a testament to resourcefulness and grit. They added variety to the menu and helped everyone endure the long, unpredictable days on the frontier.